This is the NFL version of the Hot Stove League. That's a baseball term, obviously. But if you're anywhere in Texas right now and other places around the country, and certainly in Frisco, Texas, home of the Dallas Cowboys like we are, yeah, you could use a hot stove right about now. Targets for some of the teams that we have our eyes on and some of the players that we have our eyes on, talking free agency, of course. I've come around to the idea on Patrick Peterson for Dallas. Not necessarily as a cornerback, maybe more as somebody that flips over and plays safety. We saw Ronnie Lott do this. I saw Ronnie Lott do this very successfully. We're going back 30 plus years now. Charles Woodson did it very successfully. How much money does Patrick Peterson want? That we don't know. He's a $14 million cornerback. Can you work that down quite a bit to make it work financially in Dallas? Can he be a $9 million or less player? Can you put him at safety where the Cowboys need help and could use a playmaker, a ball hawk there? Patrick Peterson can be all those things. And then, are the Cowboys a contender? Because as with Richard Sherman, who's going to be 33, Patrick Peterson, who's 30 and has basically spent a decade in a non-winning program in Arizona by and large, the chance to go, in Sherm's case, play for a championship one more time, and in Peterson's case, play for a championship the first time, that's going to be a deciding factor for Patrick Peterson on whether or not the Cowboys are on his wish list. Washington free agency. And if I was going to pick a guy who I think is a sensible match, I give you Cam Newton. Now, I know that Washington football team fans are thinking bigger than that, probably not only in free agency, but also just in terms of quarterback. Hey, Russell Wilson, what? He's being examined by the Washington football team front office, and it's true. Hey, Deshaun Watson, he wants out. Why not take a look at that? The indications that we've gotten from Ron Rivera and staff in Washington are that they don't want to over pursue a quarterback to the point where it leaves the cupboard bare, where you give up so many draft picks that now you've just RG3'd yourself. Again, Cam Newton would be affordable financially. He made under $2 million last year playing for the Patriots. It would be a reclamation project again, just like it was in New England, where the numbers were really weird. Cam Newton had 12 rushing touchdowns in New England as a quarterback. That's a red zone threat and a short yardage threat. That's pretty special. But he had 8 touchdown passes? Is that right? And 10 interceptions? Is that right? He has always been, Cam Newton, an erratic thrower. But his very best years, of course, in the NFL were with Ron Rivera as coach, and then some of the same front office people that are now involved in Washington. I think Cam Newton to Washington as a free agent is a very sensible match and a good name to watch. Houston Texans. And we're looking at 3 different levels of. In the case of Dallas, fan base always thinks big, and then it never necessarily quite happens. I mean, okay, Deion Sanders, but that was 25 years ago. In the case of Washington, they're a quarterback away. The Houston Texans obviously would like to dabble at least in free agency, and they need help all across the board. We've suggested Kawan Short, the defensive tackle from Carolina, and this isn't because Short solves all the problems. That's not it at all. He's in his 30s. He's been banged up for the last couple of years. Panthers defensive tackles, by the way, in the last couple of years that have moved elsewhere, that hasn't worked very well. Gerald McCoy, in his 30s, went to Dallas and got hurt right away. Don Terry Poe, in his 30s, went to Dallas and could not play a lick. Can Short still play? Here's why we match him up with the Texans. Frankly, beggars can't be choosers. The truth about the Texans situation is this is not a destination city. Now, you look around the NFL, and other teams have made them into that. J.J. Watt to Cleveland? Cleveland's a destination city right now? I guess so. Buffalo? Destination city? You bet. So there's still hope that Houston can be that again some way, someday. But right now, players like Short probably be on the short list, because not only do the Texans have to figure out a way to attract themselves to players, they got to figure out a way to get players to be attracted to them. So this is very much a two-way street. Who does Texas like? The Texans. Who does the Houston Texans like? Just like any other team, they have their wish list. But who likes the Texans back is an issue in Houston. Now to Dak Prescott. Good or bad idea? And we're playing with this at cowboyssi.com. Good or bad idea? Trade Dak Prescott. And again, this is a fantasy world to some degree, but play the game with us here. Trade Dak Prescott for 3 first-round picks. You do not need to put in the comments that, well, Fish, you can't trade a player who's not under contract. We know. You would have to tag him. He'd have to sign the tag. There'd have to be an understanding. Again, we're just trying to do the math on it. We're not making a prediction here. Here's the math that makes this not work for me. Where's my quarterback? I'll take 3 first-round picks. In a vacuum, that doesn't sound unfair at all. That's more than fair. But who's my quarterback on a team that I think is good enough to win the NFC East next year if somebody can play quarterback? I believe a healthy Dak Prescott would have won the NFC East last year and can win it again in 2021. Healthy, happy, signed, motivated, whatever, Dak Prescott can help the Cowboys, maybe should help the Cowboys win the NFC East in 2021. If you trade Dak Prescott for 3 number ones, for 3 first-rounders, who plays quarterback then at a level that's going to allow you to win the division and the playoffs? So the only scenario that this works for me is it's got to be the Jets, who have the 2nd overall pick. And then I get my answer there. But Carolina, with the 8th overall pick, I don't know that I'm solving my quarterback problem at 8 any more than I'm solving it at 10. So in this fantasy vacuum, I can't trade Dak Prescott unless you give me a quarterback back. And yes, I know I can't trade Dak Prescott either unless and until he's signed. The J.J. Watt story is one that's obviously still a headline grabber in Houston, and then it becomes a headline grabber all across the NFL. If you're a team that's looking for, we're 1 player away. J.J. Watt makes sense to you. If you're a team that's looking for, listen, our locker room needs a culture cleanup. J.J. Watt makes sense for you. And then there's all the romantic connections. J.J. Watt going home to Wisconsin and playing for the Packers, which I find to be very viable, and so do sources who have told us about what might very well happen here. J.J. Watt playing for the Steelers and joining his 2 brothers, viable there. J.J. Watt in Dallas is a problem, most of all because of financial clog. Until you know what you're doing with Dak Prescott, it's really hard to do something else with a guy who might be a 17 or whatever $1 million player. That's what he was scheduled to be. Whatever you want to put J.J. Watt down for, the Cowboys right now, cap clog, can't do it. That's the problem with J.J. Watt in Dallas. The idea of J.J. Watt in Washington is an intriguing one, except your first reaction is, but the Washington football team doesn't need a defensive lineman, does it? Let's hear me out on the thinking here. If you could persuade these 2 teams to dance in a Deshaun Watson trade, Deshaun Watson, of course, wants out of the Houston Texans. Washington, hungry for high-level quarterback play. And I can tell you, the view of other teams in the NFC East, They don't want Washington to get high-level quarterback play. They know how good Washington would be if they have somebody of that level. So, if these two teams could dance, and you'd have to jump over the obstacle of the Washington football team not wanting to leave the cupboard bare in draft picks. That's an issue here. They've seen what can happen when you overpay for a quarterback. R, G, and 3 would be the 3 things that can happen to your franchise. But if you could get him to dance, and Deshaun Watson ends up in Washington, part of the piece that could lure him wouldn't have to be a draft pick or draft picks only. It could be one of the members of the Washington roster who's already a standout player at what position? Defensive line. You could spare one, theoretically, along the defensive line, include that in trade, and that would cause you, if you're Washington, to be able to then say, okay, now we'll talk to J.J. Watt. It's a lot of hoops to jump through, but it's an interesting dance that could put Washington and Houston on the same dance floor. Ultimately, it's too bad in Houston that over the course of now 13 months, every single iconic player in the history of this franchise has either said, I'm out, or they've been thrown out, or they want out, or even retroactively, now Andre Johnson is saying, wish I could have done something different. Andre Johnson is bad-mouthing the team. J.J. Watt called the situation trash. Now he's gone. Deshaun Watson, I don't think we need to detail the issues there, feels betrayed, justifiably so. And DeAndre Hopkins, sent packing for reasons that still don't make any sense. And now, Andre Johnson, the iconic receiver, and one of the best 4 players in the history of this franchise, joining, of course, Watson, Watt, and Hopkins, is saying, it's always been this way. There's always been something broken. There's always been something that hasn't been quite right. Now, Andre Johnson isn't giving us many details on what those things are, but he's clearly not just talking about the Cal McNair era in Houston. He's also talking about the Bob McNair era. And the reason this is so important in Houston is because at the same time, Andre Johnson, the only one of this group of 4, by the way, that can't really leave, Andre Johnson is also saying, but I want Deshaun Watson to stay. This tells you about how sincere he is about this. He's both bad-mouthing the Texans and cares so much about them that he wants Deshaun Watson to stay. The lesson for the Cowboys, when they look at what's going on with the other franchises, and we've done this and we do it every year in the Super Bowl. What can be learned from the Super Bowl? What can the Cowboys learn? And we've addressed that, and of course it's very much about quarterback play. That's been our view here. But what can the Cowboys learn from what's happening in Washington? Look how solid Washington really is a player away. Now, it's the hardest player to get. But Washington, I think, literally is a player away because they built a unit, their defense, that's so reliable. That's a lesson for Dallas. Now look at Houston. Is there a lesson for Dallas in Houston? And of course, nobody in Dallas wants to admit that there's anything they can learn from the little brother down there. But here's the truth. When you got one, keep him. And keep him happy. And we're not talking about babying your stars. I'm not talking about the Cowboys babying Dak Prescott or babying Ezekiel Elliott or Zach Martin or anybody else that you think is a high level, Amari Cooper, whoever. Anybody else, we're not talking about babying them. We're talking about making sure you understand the value of them. What happened in Houston is that management team took for granted that they could say and do anything they wanted to their locker room. And the conduit was Deshaun Watson, but this isn't just about Deshaun Watson. This is about the whole locker room. The Cowboys should be mindful of this. Dak Prescott represents this locker room. Better be frank with him. Better be honest with him. Better be transparent with him. Because you will miss him. And a guy like him, a player like him, a person like him, when you don't have many more. Fish out.